books, military science books on how to fight battles. Had I had my own country, I would have wanted to be a general. But since we have no country, no need of me being a colon power. But I've always been fascinated with the subject, and I've always studied the subject, and that subject is very important in your daily life. If you've never studied military science, tomorrow morning you should go to bookstores and pick up some books. I've given you before names of some books. One of them is The Art of War. All right? That's one of the great books, The Art of War. Should be studied by everybody. There shouldn't be a black man in here who has not read that book from cover to cover. Twice. That's right, The Art of War. Books on guerrilla warfare. That's right. Serious books, serious discipline. So this is why I like this particular speaker, because a lot of people talk about a lot of other things and don't talk about military science. We need military scientists. Yo, I know they after me. Good, good, good. But in the meantime, while they're planning on my demise, let us hear from our speaker for the night, Dr. Amos Wilson. Let's give him a big hand.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you kindly. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate your warm welcome. It's always a pleasure to be back here with you and to share this time and space with you. And certainly your emphasis there on military science is quite appropriate. I found an interesting, for instance, in last week's, I believe it's maybe the New York Times, to see that Sears Roebuck hired a general to head its logistics department. In fact, I believe he was the general responsible for the logistics in the Middle East and Somalia. We often forget that there's a very definite relationship between business and military strategy. In fact, business and military strategy are one and the same. And that's one of the reasons why the Japanese and the Orientals are very good at their economic strategy, because military science is a built-in part of their culture. And to a great extent, unlike Africans, whose warriorhood should have been transferred into business, the Japanese transferred Bushido and their warriors into the art of doing business. And they are still then at war with the Western nations. They never stopped. They just changed their tactics and hid their strategies under other guises. Ultimately, they will win the war against the West. The World War II wasn't nearly the end, ladies and gentlemen. It was only a battle. If you've read the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, you would recognize that that paper is already indicating that they expect, should nothing divert this course, that the Chinese economy, which is the fastest growing economy in the world today, the third largest economy in the world today, by the year 2020-25, will be larger than the United States economy and the economy of Western Europe combined. And of course, I've spoken to you on a number of occasions to try to get you to understand that our struggle is not just against European men, but our struggle is against any ethnic group that threatens to oppress us. European man is basically on his way out anyway, and we talked about that in the last session. And I've asked the question, are we to gain liberation from the Europeans only to fall under another 1,000 years of oppressions from the Orientals? And the Orientals are going to be much more vicious than the Europeans. They don't have a liberal philosophy that you can use against them and a constitution that you can throw at them. They don't have that liberal image that they try to protect like the white folk that you use to tie them up with. They owe you nothing. And I've warned before about us getting too carried away talking about people of color, as if anyone who is non-white is our friend. That is a terrible, 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 terrible error. The Hispanics will be the largest minority in the United States in about 20 years. And you're going to learn what people of color are about. You're going to learn what we have been trying to teach you all the time. You're going to learn to stop trying to judge people based on your personal feelings. You see, we had this guy, Madhabani, wrote some book here based on he and his wife living together. He's married to this white woman. Yeah. And I guess the idea was, I think the idea was if she and I can live together, we can all live together. What a joke. This is nonsense. This is pure nonsense. It's pure nonsense. The relationship between peoples is not the relationship between a man and a woman, a man and his wife. No, not at all. And groups have no permanent friendships and permanent relations, as you've heard too often. They only have permanent interest. You are getting into a situation here as African Americans that Africans are in the world over. We are being isolated by other groups, by what I call the mercantile minorities. Those minorities who will be owners of business and property, all of whom then will look at us who are propertyless as criminals and thieves, and who then would look at us as ones to be protected against, and will possibly all gang up against us in protecting their own mercantile and business interests. So you got to wake up talking about people of color. You must talk about only one people of color, and that's African people. I want to thank you for your generous response to our publication, The Falsification of African Consciousness. It's moving quite well, and your response has been quite good. And here, of course, and we appreciate your patronizing the publication, because as I've indicated in other arenas, we do not make personal gain from this. These books are used to pay the rent, to maintain our place, to lay a basis for future publication and development, and for the further training in terms of our community. So when you buy, you're supporting a program that we hope to expand in terms of community education, development, and otherwise. When I say we, of course, I'm talking about Brother Sababu Plata, my partner, Sister Dorothy Lewis works with us as well, Joe Gillians, who does the book covers for us, and Robert Dobson, who's contributed to our publications in terms of finance and so forth, because we dig these things up from our pockets. We don't get grants and these other kind of things to help us forward. And it's this team, along with other friends, who have helped us to pump out these publications. Of course, the falsification of African consciousness deals with Eurocentric history, psychiatry, and the politics of white supremacy. Too many people look at history as some kind of discipline dealing with dates and events, and they look at history as a way of celebrating heroes and so forth. And this society has turned us off to history. And many of us have made the statements, well, I don't want to talk about black history or black power, I want to talk about green power. In the falsification of African consciousness, we try to demonstrate that money and power and economics are intimately related to history. You cannot take away your history and separate yourself from your history and be involved in the earning of wealth and power and the development of power. If history were that unimportant, why is it that the other people have worked so hard to take it from you? Why is it that they worked so hard to distort it and change it? They must be very apparent then that history is a key part of a people's culture and behavioral orientation. We demonstrate in that book how a loss of our sense of history has robbed us of a capacity to finance our own economic development as a people. Because the history of your people is not only a memorial to the great people in your past and so forth, but the history of your people is a history of techniques, methods of coping with problems and solving problems. The history of your people passes on to you the learned methods and techniques of dealing with various issues. So when you get to know your history and you get to know the anthropology of your people, you can use that history and anthropology to confront various problems, you see, and you won't have to learn all over again and lose a lot of time. To a good extent, our loss of history in this, particularly as African Americans, has crippled us tremendously in many, many, many ways, in terms of our family and in terms of economic development. These people that we call Koreans are using techniques for the financing of their businesses that Africans have been using for hundreds and thousands of years. Hundreds and thousands of years. The Koreans could not outfinance us as African Americans in the establishment of businesses in this country, except that we forgot how to finance businesses because we forgot what our forefathers taught us. It's not that we didn't have any money. We have plenty of money. But we don't know how to use it because we didn't look back into that history and say, how did our forefathers organize economic development? And of course, that's one of the reasons why the people robbed us of the history, so that they could take advantage of us economically and socially. Because I've said before, every characteristic that we may call maladjustive in our personalities as a people, in our society as a people, has an economic function. If you would look at any characteristic that with which we describe ourselves in maladjustive terms, you can trace that trait back to economic advantage. You see, the fact that we have not been able to recall the means by which we saved money as a people and financed business means that other people who remembered their historical techniques could establish businesses in our communities and take advantage of us. So then our amnesia, which is what we suffer from most of all, historical amnesia, works to the political, economic, and social advantage of all of those who exploit us. We talk about, of course, the technology of Eurocentric psychology. We talk about the fact that if you are a so-called normal, law-abiding African person, in terms of the way those concepts are defined in this society, then you're out of your mind. What we call pathological normalcy. We talk about the fact that personality is not just it's not really a psychological concept. People think the concept of personality is psychological. Personality essentially is a political and economic concept, you see. Because when you look at personality as an organized system of desires and wishes, values and hopes and needs and motives, which when the person seeks to satisfy them, they consume things. You will note then that the things we consume to satisfy our personal needs are those things sold to us by the people who created the needs in us to begin with. See? You have to understand that. And so by creating a so-called normal personality in black folk, we have had a personality infused in us such that when we behave normally, we work against our very best interest as a people. And that's why Eurocentric psychiatry has to be re-examined and completely restructured and destroyed and replaced by an African-centered psychology. Yes. Identity is a political economic concept. If you had the correct African-centered identity, the Koreans wouldn't be in the midst of your neighborhoods today. That's right. Because people consume, we buy, mainly as a way to affirm who we are and who we think we are. So when you let another people impose an image on you and you accept the image that they impose on you, then you go out to consume to maintain that image. Then in consumption, you are going to maintain their power over you. So you must understand then, when we talk about an identity, it is not merely a matter of race pride. It involves at its depths economics and political behavior and everything else. So when you say you're black or when you say you're African, that means that we expect a certain system of behaviors from you such that they are supportive of African peoples and African ends. We're going to come back to that shortly. So we want you to continue to buy the Falsification of African Consciousness. This is a body of works that I'm trying to get out of here before we do some other things. Before we move together with Brother Maddox into the stage of organization. But we're trying to get a body of work so we can base our organization around a set of literature. We got a large volume coming out here at the back end of November, the first part of December, Blueprint for Black Power. We finally finished it, 400 or 500 pages. We might give it to you in 2 volumes so you won't have to take it all at once. But in that book, we are going to lay out chapter and verse the means by which we can gain real power in America and in the world. We're going to discuss the forms of power, the bases of power. We're going to talk about culture and power, family and power, religious institutions and power, and that whole bit. And then we're going to go line by line in terms of the various means by which we can develop cultural institutions, economic institutions that empower us as a people. So that after this, the black nationalists at least will not be accused of just doing analysis only, because the recipe will be there. And from this point on, then, if you don't do anything, it won't be because you didn't know and you don't have the means, but you just don't want to, which is what I think is the problem anyway. But we like to hide behind, you're just giving us analysis, you see. But frankly, the answer is in the analysis, if you listen well enough. And I try to advise people who are doing work, try to frame your analysis in such a way that it has a program in it, that when you get through, there's a program built right into the results and right into the approach, you see. And that's the reason why you have to form meaningful questions from the very beginning. And you have to go into your analysis with the idea that you're looking toward a solution. While there are many true approaches to a problem and many approaches that may explain a problem, not all approaches are equally practical for solving the problem. While you can say that racism exists in America because white folk don't love us, what kind of program is there? That means now you're going to preach forever trying to get them to love you. An impractical problem, an impractical analysis. While you might say that whites dominate us because they have recessive genes, or because they have a penis envy, a color envy, whatever you want to call it. That's true. There's no problem with that. There's no problem with that. Except what kind of program does that imply? That you recess your genes? That you cut off an inch or two? That you bleach yourself? It's a perfect and it's a great answer, but you got to get a what? A programmable answer. One that can be translated into real programs. But anyway, we hope you'll be able to pick that up later on, Blueprint for Black Power, and of course followed by the main book also on educating African children for the 21st century, which has already been written, but we just got to edit it, where we will go into the whole African-centered approach to education. Tonight I want to talk a bit about the crisis of leadership and look at this crisis. Some of you no doubt saw last week's gathering of black leaders, Farrakhan, Jesse Jackson, I believe it was, the Black Caucus, and some others, and I'm sure it brought tears to your eyes. But you have to understand, it takes more than unity to win. Again, you've got to unify around a workable strategy, around a workable program. Unity is important, and it is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Who is being co-opted? Farrakhan or Jesse Jackson? Is Jesse moving closer to the nationalist position, Or is Farrakhan moving closer to the assimilationist position? Can these two types of leaderships really be merged? Or are they fundamentally and in many ways mutually exclusive in terms of their approach to the problems of black people? We have to think about that, you see. It's not enough to hug and embrace on the stage. When Chavis says that he is now concerned with the economic problems of black folk, does he mean the same thing that Farrakhan means or someone else means when they say they're concerned about the economic problems of black folk? And why is the thrust of the NAACP on economics at this late day in history? Do we have a group trying to take over a nationalist theme and use it to maintain itself and bring itself back to relevance and life? We have to look at this, ladies and gentlemen. When I look at this kind of meeting, I'm sort of reminded of a phrase that Frederick Douglass used when he was brought in to head the Freedmen's Bureau after it had been corrupted and basically destroyed. And I think the phrase was something like, it was like marrying a corpse. The embracing of moribund and dying organizations is pretty much a similar situation. And some organizations deserve to die a peaceful death. It's an interesting game. Some of you heard this New York Times editorial, right? Yep. How many managed to read that editorial concerning that caucus meeting? Let me just take up a little time here to sort of read this little piece to you. It was very interesting, came out last Saturday. The Black Caucus gets mugged. There's your psycholinguistics. black and mugged, you know. Yeah, you know, the Black Caucus gets mugged. Shows you again, it's very subtle use of terms. Why mugged? You see. A game being played here with words by the venerable New York Times. In the days ahead, the Congressional Black Caucus may find itself in an advantageous position. What do you call that? Build you up to tear you down? In a Congress riven with discord over NAFTA, the economy and other issues, the Black Caucus counts 39 votes in the House and one in a Senate that often produces squeaker votes. And we know many of the bills that Clinton gets through the Senate often passed by just one vote. Right. So this one black person has a quote-unquote power there. So they're admitting this. You got 39 blacks in the Congress, one in the Senate, and in a situation where votes now tend to be very narrow, they have an additional influence on legislative outcomes, which means that we as the New York Times are concerned about how they play ball. But the Black Caucus's chairman, Kwesi Mfume, Democrat of Maryland, seems not to understand the uses of power. So now we take him to the woodshed here. We don't understand the uses of power. When Mr. Mfume embraced Louis Farrakhan last week in Washington, he temporarily lost the savvy he has shown while legislating and behaved like a novice. This arrogance never ends. Mr. Mfume was had. So was the Black Caucus. The occasion for this mugging was the caucus's annual legislative meeting, specifically a panel on race and politics at the Washington Convention Center. The participants included Mr. Mfume, Mr. Farrakhan, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Benjamin Chavis of the NAACP. Mr. Farrakhan's presence was an invitation to trouble. So get the signal. Given his previous anti-Semitic railings, and especially his description of Judaism as a gutter religion, and never let it go. But this is the nature of power. When you got a stick in your hand that you can use against someone, you don't turn it loose. Mr. Mafumi declared a détente between the caucus and the black Muslim, among others. I wonder who the others are here. No longer will we allow people to divide us, he said, adding that such a union was needed to bring about change. Put this in quotes. Some say Mr. Mafumi, who only recently abandoned radical for mainstream politics, was caught up in the moment and broached the issue without consulting the caucus. So you know what's going on here, right? Some Negroes have run back to the white folk. And so, hey, look, he got carried away. We didn't give him permission to say this. So you can see the old game goes on right at the so-called high levels of power. He got carried away, and he didn't have our permission. So don't look at us. And of course, the Times, in its magisterial and paternal way, says, perhaps. But his conduct suggests a misconception about what constitutes genuine leadership and whence its power flows. Don't forget where your power comes from. The members of the Black Caucus were given mandates and missions by the voters who sent them to Washington. They have a real political foundation of voters who expect change, in quotes, all right, but expect it in legislation that will benefit them. It's reasonable for the caucus to reach out, but Mr. Mafumi and his duly elected colleagues needn't be threatened or guilt-tripped into sharing platforms with people without portfolio who would soon drop from sight if the press ceased to cover them. So the old game, we make leaders. So if we stop covering him, he will cease to exist. Isn't this an arrogance here? As if Farrakhan and other people came into existence as a result of coverage by the New York Times. Or if the Black Caucus ceased to invite them to conferences. Mr. Mafumi diluted his hard-won authority of office by extending it to a freelance rhetorician well known as a hater. The caucus gets only bad karma. They must know our people. They know we respond to spiritual words, right? Bad karma. And negative publicity in return. That's a political mugging, pure and simple. The chairman of the Black Caucus ought to know better. Perhaps his membership can teach him. Okay, that's the woodshed there. Telling these other caucus members what? Yes, you better go and teach him something. This points to a crisis of black leadership. When these people some look up to as leaders are being chastised by paternalistic white newspapers. And when the white press still thinks that it has the capacity to determine who will be called a black leader and recognized as a black leader. It speaks to an issue of long-standing, this issue of a leadership crisis. And we saw this crisis in the politics of Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, and Marcus Garvey. Washington and his de-emphasis of political power and insistence on civil rights and higher education in pursuit of industrial education, accumulation of wealth, and the conciliation with the South. And of course, Du Bois, with his emphasis on rights to vote, civic equality, and education of youth according to ability. Douglass, with his extreme assimilationism, married to his white wife, believing that the ultimate goal of African people was to amalgamate and assimilate biologically with whites, who, after his marriage, attacked race pride and attacked racial solidarity and attacked what he called economic chauvinism. And of course, Marcus Garvey, with his pursuit of economic chauvinism, race, history, and culture, and African liberation. We often get carried away sometimes in trying to analyze the conflicts between Washington and Du Bois, and particularly do we get carried away when we talk about Du Bois's talented 10th. But I think before we start name-calling and categorizing, because both these men, Washington and Du Bois, are quite complex men. They do not easily fit into categories. You do have to face the question, is Washington such an Uncle Tom, or is he really being diplomatic? Is he playing a game? And there's some evidence that a game was being played. While he was in an apparent struggle with Du Bois over the issue of civil rights and the issues, let us say, of voting publicly, he often, using his own personal finances, contributed to those struggling to maintain voting rights for blacks in the South. This is not necessarily to resuscitate his image and his accommodationism, but it is just merely to caution us sometimes not to too rapidly judge the character of these people based on simplistic categories. Du Bois, of course, was exceedingly complex as a person and changed a great deal over his long lifetime. Du Bois came to repudiate to a good degree, to a significant degree, the concept of the talented 10th. We rarely hear about that, though. But if you read his The Dusk of Dawn, you will see it right there. And he admits the error in that thought. He admits that this black middle class that he hoped would be committed to the race and would put race first was non-nationalistic. Du Bois was very committed also to African pride and race pride, and consistently did research in terms of African history and in terms of what we would call today Afrocentricity. But this is often looked over by those who are too quick to put him in the Boule class and other kinds of simplistic categories. When you look at Du Bois, you will see often his changes reflecting the changes in America. Du Bois is first and foremost a thinker and an observer and an analyst. And he's constantly looking at the realities of Africans in America, and he shifts his visions and is not afraid to change his mind and go against his prior opinions when that reality suggests that those opinions were wrong. As he moved through his life, then you see him coming much closer to the Booker Washington economic program. Again, you can verify this by reading Dusk of Dawn, where he suggests a separate economy for African American people, where he suggests a voluntary economy, where he deals with the fact that blacks are segregated and will stay segregated for decades. And therefore, they should take advantage of that fact and use it to their political and economic advantage. This is very clear and stated. He talks about a commonwealth, what he calls an economic cooperative commonwealth, that blacks would have to use a cooperative approach to economic development. He even sees that as a result of our economic struggle to gain control over our internal markets as African people, that we will receive resistance from other groups, and he talks about it very clearly. Many forget that Du Bois resigned, and really the word was kicked out of the NAACP in 1934. And he was kicked out essentially over the very issue of economics when he charged that organization with not having an economic and a full social program for African people. In fact, he states in one of his statements here very clearly that when he critiques the NAACP, when he talks about them as being a protest organization and insistently demanding equality and equal right to work and so forth, and dealing in moral suasion and propaganda and possibly even physical resistance, and he says this is good. There are, however, manifest difficulties about such a program. First of all, it is not a program that envisages any direct action of Negroes for the uplift of their socially depressed masses. In the very conception of the program, such work is to be attended by the nation, and Negroes are to be the subjects of uplift forces and agencies to the extent of their numbers and need. Another difficulty is that the effective organization of this plan of protests and agitation involves a large degree of inner union and agreement among Negroes. What is he saying here is, what you're doing as an organization, NAACP, is that you're leaving black folks to be the subject of government agencies and to be the subject of other people. And this is not a correct program. You do not have a program by means of which black people uplift themselves through their own strength and power and resources. And therefore, this is a program doomed for failure. He asked them to confront the issues of the fact that blacks were in segregated schools. And what are we going to do about that? How are we going to improve these schools and work with these schools as they are and change them in our best interest? Instead of, as I will talk about later, living these dreams of the NAACP about some future integrated society. In his letter of resignation, he states, today this organization, referring to the NAACP, which has been great and effective for nearly a quarter of a century, finds itself in a time of crisis and change, without a program, without effective organization, without executive officers who have either the ability or disposition to guide the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the right direction. We can literally say the same thing about the NAACP when? Today. So more than classifying Du Bois or classifying Washington, I think it would be far more productive for us to look at the issues that Du Bois and Washington and the others were dealing with, and that was the issue of the crisis of leadership in the black community. Instead of looking at the talented merely as some elitist approach to the solution of black problems, we must look at it within the context of people who were struggling to find some leadership structure that would resolve the issues which confront black people, one of which might have been the use of a talented group. Another which may have been the use of the emphasis on economic development, you see. So I think before we get lost in classifying and categorizing, we should deal with the real issue, and that issue is that there is a crisis of leadership in the African American community, and this crisis of leadership has been going on now for well over 80 years. So as early as the 1900s and the late 1800s, blacks were wrestling over the issue of the appropriateness of leadership. Du Bois, in resigning and getting kicked out of the NAACP, is dealing with the fact that it is during the Depression and that he is looking at this organization. And the crisis that the NAACP is experiencing is the fact that it has no economic program to meet the needs of the starving black people during that Depression. It was without program. It had permitted Jews and other white liberals to infiltrate its organization and impose what Harold Cruz calls non-economic liberalism on them as the central part of their program. A program that did not in any way deal directly with the economic issues facing the black community. And so, yes, still here, still the problem. We are faced exactly with the same situation today. As the American system was undergoing restructuring during the Great Depression, as capitalism, American capitalism, was basically on its deathbed, black people and the leadership of black people faced a major crisis. And just as Roosevelt saved capitalism through the socialistic programs of the New Deal, the NAACP was saved for a change. But today we are still faced with the same issue. Now we are undergoing another major restructuring of the American economic system, a major restructuring of the global economic system. And now we are faced again with an organization which is supposed to be our premier leadership organization that has no economic plan, no program, has not even yet written one or talked about one, except to throw out a word or two that we are going to be concerned about the economics of black folk. That now is raising $100 million to try to wake up its corpse. If you read the other day, Reginald Lewis willed them $2 million. And they are in the process of raising $100 million so that they can continue to impose their destructive leadership on black people in America. We have to watch this kind of thing. Got to come back to this. So what does he mean? And we got a bunch of people running to Africa, sponsored by corporations, having an economic summit in Africa when they have yet to have one in the United States. For the key to economic development on that continent is right here on this one. But we have a leadership that finds it easier to lead and deal with faraway problems and issues rather than to deal with the ones right here at home. And this is a major issue. Why are we faced with these same problems again and again? Why do they never end? Because, ladies and gentlemen, ultimately the problem is not an economic problem so much as it is the problem of white domination of African people. That's the issue. This is the reason why I tell people you must study the psychology of domination even before you study the psychology of racism. Because racism is just a species, a subclass of domination. It is merely a rationalizing of the domination of one race by another. You must recognize then that domination is a problem, particularly for the dominated, and that the dominant dominate because it is to their what? Benefit to do so, because they benefit from it. Which means then that they benefit from the problems of the dominated. It's the problems of African people that are productive and beneficial for those who dominate us. Consequently, they must never release us from our problems because our problems are so profitable for them. This is what you got to keep in mind. Know the essence of domination is that the dominated must be made to do what? Work against their best interest. Or otherwise, what is the point? You're not bought under domination to work for what? Your own best interest. You're dominated to work in the best interest of those that dominate you. So to be dominated means, if you're not aware and awake and alive and conscious, that you're going to work against your own best interest as a people. And that means then, as long as domination continues, the problems generated by domination will continue. And even when one problem invented or created by domination appears to have been solved, what is going to happen? Another will arise. Or the same problem will take what? A different form. So if it was the Great Depression in the late 20s and in the 30s, it's called global restructuring in the 1990s. But all in all, it means the same thing: being out of job, out of work, homeless, and in the street, no matter how you describe it. Because the other people who dominate the system are going to shed you first before they shed themselves or anyone else. And the game continues, which ultimately means then, ladies and gentlemen, any solid black leadership must see the overthrow of the domination of whites as the ultimate solution. It must see the destruction of white supremacy and the disempowering of the white man as one of its major goals. Otherwise, you'll never get out of it. And one day, if he sees that the ultimate benefit to himself lies in the total death and destruction of African people, then he's going to kill you dead. And if you look at the history of the European, he does not feed useless people for long. The Indian, the Native American, was wiped out on this continent because to a great extent he was of little or no economic use to the European. No amount of love, no amount of constitutional rules and laws will prevent this from happening to African people. We have to come alive to that fact. And African people are becoming economically useless the world over. When they finally stabilize this old shaky Soviet Union, who has mineral wealth that rivals that of the African continent, that's already now dumping metals and minerals and so forth on the world markets and depressing those prices at this point. When they bring that country online, will the African continent even be able to survive by selling its raw materials? That's a major problem. The sellout of Nelson Mandela. Yes, it's a bourgeois leadership. You may as well face the reality of it. The day Nelson Mandela is a condition of leaving prison, promised those whites that their properties would not be nationalized and would not be taken back and redistributed among the natives of South Africa. The game was up then. Yes, you may as well face the reality. And we have this kind of situation all over the continent of Africa, where the original, yes, and it's a joke to talk about Namibia being liberated, with 75% of its most arable land still owned by whites, with this wealth being owned by whites. What kind of liberation are you talking about? When you look at Zimbabwe, that negotiated a so-called treaty or independence, and the whites promised them that after 10 years they would turn the land loose. And when the 10 years were up, the other white nations said, hey, forget about it. And now the African farmers and other people are still without land. Ladies and gentlemen, you got to learn that you got to fight a war to the death. You got to fight a war until your enemy surrenders so that you can dictate the terms. If you fight a war and then you've got to sit at the table and really go through negotiations, you have not won. Now, if you can't dictate the terms of peace, you have not won the war. You see? And we got a lot of that kind of stuff going on in the African situation today. Yes, all over. Because the African situation is worldwide. It doesn't matter where you are. The same politics that inheres in America, inheres in Africa, Central, South America, everywhere. It's the same game. Because you have the same what? Domination. Yeah, the domination is global. So you have the same kind of problems. You see, and you have to face that as a reality. If this nation, this South African so-called nation, leaves intact, the white ownership of property and so forth, it's going to change the whole of that continent because that nation will become the economic engine of the continent. And the African nations on the rest of the continent will trade with it and in many ways become economically associated and dependent on it, which will permit then an even deeper penetration by whites and others into the continent as a whole under the bogus title of a multiracial society. You have to wake up. You cannot let any leader become a sacred cow to the point where you forget how to perform a realistic analysis on the situation. Because ultimately it is your individual lives and the life of our people that is at question here, not the glory and power of an individual person or leader, but of the people themselves. And so we see this crisis of leadership all over the place. And it is time now for us to move toward its resolution. I think we are in a better position at this point because unlike Du Bois and Washington and the others who were in a sense at the front end of these issues, we have had now 80, 90 years to see what happened. We can measure results. Therefore, we can take an empirical approach, an empirical analysis, an analysis based on experiment, an analysis based on actual experience, an analysis that looks at the NAACP's programs and look at the results, that looks at the programs of other leaders and look at the results that they wrought. So we don't have to guess and we don't have to be quite as theoretical as we used to be. We can say, let's see what the results bear out. And let's see if this form of leadership can be justified any longer based on its results. And this is what we have to measure. An interesting case, we'll be back to him shortly. To a great extent then, we're going to have to look at the issue of power, a word that we've been taught as people to avoid and to think is immoral. And it is a pity that we've been led in this direction. Because, ladies and gentlemen, power is the crucial measure of the effectiveness of leadership as to whether that leadership empowers the people. Because we have to recognize that the primary source of the host of problems that confront African people the world over and in America is powerlessness. Yes. Yes. We are suffering from not using our potential as a people. Yes. Powerlessness. If we were able to create jobs, but able is the essence of what? Power. To be able what? To. The ability to. You see? Power is created in terms of resistance, the ability to move against resistance, to expend energy and to focus energy in changing circumstances in terms of one's own benefits. This is what power is about. Power is necessary to all living things. It is the essence of life. If you do not have any power, you are not alive. That's right. It takes power for you to chew your food. It takes power for you to digest it, to convert it into nutrients so that you may continue to survive. It takes power for you to stand up against the resistance of gravitation. It takes power for you to earn the living from the earth and everything else. You have to have what? Ability. You have to be able to do those things necessary to maintain life. You've seen people, sometimes unfortunate people, like some of the children in Somalia and people in Somalia who do not even have the power to chew and who must die unless they're intravenously fed because they no longer have the power to even masticate the food in their mouths or to digest it. There is no life without power. And therefore, the pursuit of power is necessary for the pursuit of life and for maintaining the viability of life. So don't let anyone deceive you into thinking that there's virtue in powerlessness. And just as power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, powerlessness corrupts and also corrupts absolutely. A lot of the corruption that you see out on these streets, the shooting and the killing and the selling of drugs and so forth, the muggings, the stealings, the robberies, and all of this is a result of powerlessness. And powerlessness corrupting a people and corrupting a culture. Yes. Creating terror and horror in our communities. Because we are not able, we have not empowered ourselves to provide our young people with what? Jobs and alternatives to mugging, to robbing, to stealing, to terrorizing. Look at the difference between those, in terms of crime, between those groups who own property, who have a control over economic resources and so forth, who exercise political power and economic power in this society, and those of us who do not. And you can see immediately then that the power itself, powerlessness itself, becomes a source, therefore, of corruption. And therefore, if we are to change the nature of our system, we must change from powerlessness to power. And ultimately, though, social power comes out of the relationship among people and persons. Social power is, in essence, collective. We have to keep that in mind because we normally think of individuals as powerful. But individuals gain their power from being backed up by a powerful group. That's right. Yes. Individual whites are not powerful. That's right. What power they possess or seem to possess is because they represent the power of their group. That's right. The individual cannot be separated from his or her group. Right. In fact, the individual is a social creation to begin with. The individual cannot exist in a vacuum. You have a language that you share with millions of other people. You have attitudes, appetites, and all of these other things that are the result of your doing what? Living socially among another group of people. You have desires and so forth that have not only been generated from your social interaction with other people and living in a social system, but desires and wishes that can only be satisfied by that social system. You cannot satisfy them all by yourself at all. And yet we are deceived in this country talking about what? Individualism. as if all people can be an island unto themselves and yet meet their every need, other people. So ultimately, social power is in essence collective, and it involves two essentials: intentionality, by which we mean purpose and motive, and resources. When people have intentions, motives, and purpose, and they bring resources to bear in their situation to solve a particular problem. One of the things that we are dealing with then in this community, that we're dealing with in our volume on Blueprint for Black Power, is the fact that black people in America have tremendous resources. I talk about in this book the fact that we are a nation of people who are from 10 to 80% of the population of 117 of America's largest cities. We have 50 to 60 cities of which we are essentially about 50% of the population of those cities, above 100,000. We are the majority population in about 17 of those cities, and those cities are scattered across this country. They're connected by highways, roads of all type, railways, riverways, air routes, all types of things, all of the things necessary for a nation to function, we have available to us. Fax machines, telephones, all of this we have as African people. And we have what? Money. W.E. Du Bois stated very clearly in The Dusk of Dawn that if black people could get only a fraction of their internal market, their influence on the economic and political life of themselves and America would be decisive. Now, when I first looked at that statement, I thought it was an exaggeration until I started analyzing the figures. And we started working with the figures. We're talking about a people who earn over $300 billion. Yes. But recognize, as I've told you before, the issue is not so much what you earn, but what? What you produce. Because you get paid only a fraction of what you produce. So if we're getting paid $300 billion, we must be producing well over $1 trillion or more dollars as a people. Yes. And yet we have a business section that only collects about $20 billion as African people. That means African people in America are spending over $300 billion, and the total receipt of black businesses amount only to $20 billion. But you see, I'm an optimist. I don't ask, is the glass half empty? I say it's what? It's half full. And I recognize that oaks from acorns grow. And I recognize then that that means that African people are spending less than 5 cents with black businesses. And that says then if we are spending less than 5 cents with black businesses and yet we are providing them with $20 billion, what if we spent 10 cents out of every consumer dollar? An additional 5 cents of spending out of each dollar as black people would amount to a total receipt and earnings by black businesses of approximately $60 billion. I didn't say 40 billion, I said 60 billion, because when you buy into a business, it uses the income also for what? Investment. Therefore, it multiplies what it takes in. So if we got you up to 15 cents out of a dollar, then we're headed well towards 75 billion. We've only asked you for 15 cents. You can give your 85 cents to the white boy. If we get you up to 20 cents and 25 cents, we got now black business past what? 100 billion and headed toward 150 billion. What would happen if we got you up to 30 cents? You can still give white folks what? 70 cents. You can feel happy. You can say, I'm multicultural. We don't even ask you to be black and African, you know. We're not asking you for your whole dollar. I'm telling nationalists now we have to change our language. Maybe we just say, look, just spend a dime. That's all. All we want to ask you to do is this. If you make $30,000 a year, pledge $3,000 to a black business. Okay? And if you do that, you're going to see black business transform itself overnight, just with that. And we look at these other figures, ladies and gentlemen, you won't believe what possibilities we have as people. We have the talent, we have the skills, we have the whole thing, but we are missing the program. We're missing the leadership. We're missing the sense of purpose. And without the sense of purpose and with the resources, we are not going to be empowered. And the sense of mission is of key importance to bringing about power. And that sense of mission, though, has not been established by our leadership. And since it has not, it has placed us in danger. Let's look at this cry for leadership among our people, because our people see something here. 40 years at the United States Supreme Court, outlawed segregation of the races in America's schools, supposedly in the interest of providing equal education through racial integration. The majority of black students find themselves in hyper-segregated urban ghetto schools, entrapped in an educational system that is in severe crisis and imminent danger of total collapse. We've had an experiment, ladies and gentlemen. The Supreme Court decision has been made. The busing has taken place. The surrounding of schools and shipping our students out has taken place. What is the condition of our people today? Hyper-segregated in the midst of in the midst of our urban ghettos. So the issue Du Bois raised early in this whole organizational career was what? What are you going to do about the people who are not in white schools? What are you going to do about the fact that the people are not integrated? Are they then to be made to sit around and wait for this great millennial era when all people shall be living together, black boys and white girls and all that other kind of stuff? Or must we see about the needs of our people right now? 40 years that the blacks in Montgomery, Alabama won the right to ride in the front of the bus. Blacks in urban America are virtually the only ones, along with other forlorn minorities, riding the buses. I tell you, the white man gives you what you want with the vengeance. He tells you, you say you want to ride in the front? Good, I'll give you the whole bus. And so now you're the only one riding it. You got the front, the back, and the sides all to yourself. He's got his own express buses and other means of getting into the city. This is 40 years of, what is this now, 55? It's now not near 95. So the issue of riding in front of the bus has not been solved in the way you thought it would be, did it? 30 years after gaining the right to vote, having benefited from the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Act of 1964-65, blacks in urban America, you see, can vote for black politicians who cannot improve their plight, and can vote for the President of the United States. The only problem being that the big cities where blacks predominate are no longer important as the suburbs in electing the president. In other words, so you see, before we became majorities in the United States, it was the big cities and the big city mayors and so forth that determined the presidential candidates and determined who would be president. As soon as you got the vote, the strength of the vote now is in the suburbs. And presidents now can be elected on suburban white votes. And therefore, the presidential candidates need no longer pay much attention to urban black votes, which is one of the reasons why then both Democrats and Republicans run hard during their campaigns against black people and the interests of black people. The only way they can maintain office and gain office is by running against black images, against Willie Hortons, against so-called crime and the other things, because that's the way they're going to get white suburban votes, people who are not even really being threatened by black crime, because it is black people in black cities who are the major victims of black-on-black violence. However, that violence is used to frighten white folk in electing presidents and other national and state officers. 20 years after passing the fair housing legislation, blacks are hyper-segregated in urban ghettos and in suburban neighborhoods. Where still, many blacks are homeless, sleeping on the sidewalks, on the bridges, and in abandoned buildings. If you would read this month's Emerge magazine based on an article based on a very interesting book called Apartheid USA, you would read a startling statement that says a black family that earns $50,000 has less choices of where it will live and how it would live than a Hispanic who earns $2,500. So where's your fair housing? What has it gained you? Blacks are more segregated today than we were in 1920 and in 1940. The whole movement of the demographics of America is to isolate black people totally in the urban ghettos and in the suburbs as well. That's right. And yet you brag about your fair housing laws. Yes, look at the reality of the situation. Look at the organizations that led these kind of campaigns. Look at the leadership that told us that these kinds of legislation would rescue us and make us hold hands with little black boys and little black girls. Where are we today? And what are our circumstances? 20 years after passing this law, we are in more trouble than ever. After 25 years of affirmative action, blacks find themselves kicked out of corporate America, find themselves with the highest unemployment rates, drifting into poverty ever more rapidly, while other ethnic groups gain employment ever more swiftly. And we find ourselves begging for handouts on the streets of America. If you read a detailed analysis in the Wall Street Journal last week, 2 full pages, and a full column saying what? Losing ground. Blacks, the only group that suffered a total loss of employment during the recession. This is your affirmative action for you. Blacks who were 10, 15% of the working staffs of many corporations suffered 20, 30, 40, almost 50% of the cuts in jobs. During 90 and 91, when 60,000 blacks lost their jobs in American corporations, 60,000 Asians moved into jobs in American corporations. 55,000 Hispanics moved into jobs in American corporations. Where is your people of color? Where are these people every time they stand up? They say black and Latino. And yet we don't hear a word coming the other way. Yes, the white man gives you what you want with a vengeance. He says, you want it, I'll give it to you. You want affirmative action, we'll make everybody a minority. We'll bring the white women in on it. We'll bring all the other ethnics in on it. We'll lay a game on you called diversity in the workplace, and you'll fall for it. And then they will say, well, since we've got to hire all these other groups, we have to cut back on the number of people that we hire from you. Now, you can't object to us hiring Hispanics and Asians, can you? The most interesting thing about this situation, ladies and gentlemen, is that while we are flowing out of American corporations and black blue-collar workers are suffering great losses, with other ethnic groups gaining, this is at the very point where some 60 black people, distinguished Negro leaders, sit on nearly 170 corporate boards. Yes. People such as Vernon Jordan sits on 10 and earns $500,000 a year from just having his name on the boards. Okay? Did you read the piece last week? He's Clinton's favorite guy. Yeah. When Clinton wants to have fun, he calls Vernon. They play golf and go on the yacht together, and and he runs interference for Clinton, and they're just good old buddies. Even his law firm says we didn't hire Jordan for his legal talents. They just said it up front. His role is to play golf and play around. Yes. He wouldn't take an offer to be Attorney General because he could have more clout sitting in the position that he's in. And the other civil rights organizations are wondering, say, Vernon, when are you going to give us a break? When are you going to act in the interests of black folk? He said, but I'm out of the civil rights game now. So isn't it a paradox then that at the very point where we are being kicked out of America's corporations, we have blacks sitting on America's corporate boards? Some sitting on 5 and 6 and as many as 10. Is that the reason perhaps we don't hear about the losses that we are suffering? Is the situation one that by appointing these token Negroes to these boards, we will no longer complain, or they have had their mouths shut so that they no longer complain about our not being there, ladies and gentlemen? This is the result of affirmative action, the result of assimilationist program. 25 years after the initiation of black capitalism, blacks find their communities' markets dominated by aliens. Black business persons find they can't do business in America nor with America. After 40 years of being America's moral conscience, as a lot of Negroes like to brag about, blacks find their communities being devastated by immorality. After preaching brotherly love and race-transcending love, they find themselves to be the most hated of races. For blacks in America, 30 years after having the ringing words, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last, America has become even more of a prison, sealing their bodies, hopes, and aspirations in the dungeons of despair. For African Americans all over, for African Americans, all the promises of the civil rights era have been betrayed. Everything has been reversed. The more black elected officials have been elected, the worse off the black electorate has become. Yes. Black homelessness became a national scandal when a black man was appointed Secretary of Housing. The black community was overrun with AIDS, drugs, addiction, TB, and all sorts of diseases and maladies when a black man was appointed Secretary of Health. Black nations were overrun by the imperial armies of the United States when a black man was head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The more black judges appointed to the bench, the more black men became police commissioners and police officers, the more black men filled America's prisons. And black-on-black violence ravaged America's black ghettos. Let's look at it. The Honorable Supreme Court Justice, late Justice Thurgood Marshall, achieved greater victories in the United States Supreme Court as a lawyer than he did as a judge sitting on his bench. In fact, he sat on the bench and sadly witnessed his life's work being ravaged and savaged by a mean-spirited bench. As a black man assumed to become Secretary of Commerce, blacks as an ethnic group are the least ones engaged in what? Commerce, at home and abroad. In 1993, at the appointment of a black woman as Surgeon General, an ardent advocate of sex education and the dispensing of condoms, black teenage pregnancy and female-headed families threatened the very foundations of the black family and culture and the viability of the black community. This is the legacy of the leadership that we have confronted, ladies and gentlemen. And we must look at this situation and under whose leadership and what leadership this occurred. It occurred under the leadership of what I call the assimilationist, moralist leadership establishment. Those people who told us that our salvation lay in assimilating with other folk. We look at this shame as we see more black mayors elected, the deterioration of the black community hastened. Let's look quickly at the federal contributions to certain large cities in America. In 1977, let's look at the amount that the federal government contributed to city budgets. And let's compare that with what they received from the federal government in 1985, periods during which black mayors were presiding over some of America's cities. In 1977, New York City's budget, 19% of it was gotten from the federal government. By 85, it was only 9%. Los Angeles started with 18%. By 85, it was 2%. Chicago, 27% in 77, 15% in 85. Philadelphia, 20% in 77, 8% in 85. Detroit, 23%, now in 85, 12%. Baltimore, 20%, 85, 6%. Pittsburgh, 24%, 85, 13%. Boston, 13%, in 85, 7%. Cleveland, 33%, in 85, 19%. Minneapolis, 21%, in 85, 9%. So are the black mayors bringing in the money? Are the elected officials bringing in the money? As a matter of fact, what you have going on here, ladies and gentlemen, is a war against black cities. You have the federal government itself engaging in the provocation of black populations to riot, so that under the cover of bringing law and order, they may impose martial law on those populations and destroy those populations. This is the kind of game that hides itself behind a bourgeois leadership. I wanted to tell you the other evening when I was over at Brother Roy's about bourgeois radio. We didn't have time. You have to recognize one thing, you see. When we talk about the media in America, we look at who owns the media. You see, and we note that this media is owned by about 10 corporations that own about 80% of the media. Few companies owning over 200 cable companies and so forth. And you see the struggle now over who's going to own the cable operations, who's going to control communications in America. And we recognize then that those who own the media, because what? A free press only belongs to the person who what? Owns one. Okay? That obviously if the bourgeois element in America and the ruling elite in America owns the media, then the media will be used by that class to carry out its programs and its ideologies. And it will use the media to try to brainwash and falsify the consciousness of African people. But while we look at that, we must look at the ownership of our own media. Yes. And see what class of people own that media. Then you can solve the puzzle as to why that media is always preaching to you about voting. As if voting was the only source of power in America. Because those people that own those stations achieve their social position and power through America's electoral system. That's why it's important to them. Because the class of people that own those stations and control those stations got their position through what? Electioneering and by being attached to the Democratic Party. And one thing that a bourgeois leadership and a leadership elite tries to do is to convince the masses that the masses can have their interests satisfied by satisfying the bourgeois' interests. And therefore, when they get elected to office, or they get high appointed office, they tell you, ain't we progressing? Doesn't that mean an advancement for black folk? When they are the only one who have advanced, and you don't have a new nickel in your pocket as a result of their being in this position. And so they want to make you think that their elections and their ability to wheedle out of the Democratic parties and the Republican parties money that advance their economic interests represents an advancement for you. And therefore they fail to give you a true education as to what politics is really about in America. And power in America is not in voting. You have to understand that. Why? If you'd even review your own history, you would recognize that what you call your most significant victories were gained before you gained the right to vote in 1964 and 1965. Did you vote to get the vote?
Absolutely not.
Huh? Recognize what you're going on here. But someone will tell you that there's no other way. But what did we say? Power in America is based in America's corporations. Is determined by those who own the means of production and who own property. Power and property ownership go together in America. No property-less people, no people who own no productive businesses are in power in America. I don't care what kind of votes they have. And recognize this, that where the power is, you cannot vote them out of power. Because those who run America's multinational corporations and run America's institutions don't run for office. They tell the people in office what to do. And therefore, if you're to wield real power in America, you must own the sources of power. And those sources mean the ownership of productive facilities and the ownership of property. And the control of major institutions and the ability to weld yourself together as a people and to control your consumption and to control your behavior in ways that you can exert your influence upon this system. But yet we get a medium that tells people, vote, vote, go out and vote. And you're going to suffer all the more as a result thereof. Yes, you got to face the reality. You got to know where it's going. Power lies in strategy. It lies in technique. It lies in alignment. You see. Why were blacks before they got to vote able to change the South? Through voting? Through alignments, through alliances, through control of their consumer rights. As you said time and time again, that to a great extent the civil rights movement was a consumer movement. It was a situation where blacks refused to spend their money in particular ways and in particular places. And by withdrawing their consumption, they were able to change the South before a single law was passed in their favor. Just the ability of black people to line up side by side and shoulder to shoulder and to march in one straight line changed the face of the South. So what does it say? Just the ability to sit in front of a door and not permit other people to pass is power. The ability to chain yourself down is power, ladies and gentlemen. Ultimately, it means that power arrives out of cooperation, out of alignment, out of strategy, and out of technique, and out of a sense of purpose and mission, and out of the ability to withdraw support. By voting in this system of domination in a way you legitimate your own domination as a people. And you have to watch it. Let's learn where power is, and that's what we're going to be talking about in Blueprint for Black Power. Where is it? We have this NAACP, this assimilationist, moralist leadership that sees the solution of black problems It's involving the assimilating with people. But I just got through telling you that blacks are now more segregated than ever. So if our power depends on assimilation, we're in deep trouble. Yes. We have some group of preachers who try to tell you that the major problem in America is moral. Yes, that's why I call them moralists. That these people are stereotyped or some kind of way. And if we get them understanding, you see these little silly ads on TV, you know, stop the hate. As if this was going to change something. As if the problem is hate. If the problem is they have a wrong knowledge of who you are. Come on. Yes. That the problem is one of morals. And therefore, what we got to do is convert these white people to their own religion. And we got to make them true believers in their own constitution. And that way we will be free. You're out of your mind. Every revolution has had to deal with the issue of whether you should struggle for abstract rights or struggle for a right to meet the basic needs of the people. This was the issue that Booker was working with too. He was weighing that issue. Is the voting the really primary thing, getting black people to vote, getting civil rights the primary thing, or should we see about feeding the people first, building an economic base, and then moving into the civil rights and voting thing? When we look at the history of other immigrant groups and ethnic groups, we've seen them almost be silent on the issue of voting and civil rights and so forth, as they moved into the black communities and other communities and established an economic base. And then after getting an economic base, using that base as a political tool. You see now the vendors are being swept from the streets of Brooklyn, and they're being swept from the streets of Harlem on black folks' money. You sat up here and you supported these Koreans. You didn't see color when you spent your money. You wouldn't let somebody else tell you how to spend my money. And they paid you back. You talked about multiculturalism, and yet not a one of you is in partnership with a Korean. Not one of you is in partnership with an Arab. Not one of you is in partnership with white folk. Where are the multicultural businesses? Where are the multicultural economic situations? What are you talking about, multiculturalism? Where is it? They laid it on you. And yet in Blueprint for Black Power, I talk very straightforwardly about the Korean organizations. I named the presidents. We're calling names here, ladies and gentlemen. And they are called the Korean Producers Association, the Korean Grocers Association, the Koreans of Greater New York Association, not Multicultural Association, not Multicultural Grocers Association. No, Korean grocers, Korean producers. You understand? But we are for people of color. They're even buying your politicians. A month or two ago, they took a group of these Negroes from the Black Caucus to Korea. Wined them and dined them. Presented seminars about race harmony to them. So your own legislative people will become their cogs and will be used by them to operate against your very interest because you are colorblind and you wanted to assimilate. In the New York Times, they told you up front, and we quote the dates and the places in Blueprint for Black Power. They stated very clearly, now we got the money. We want to now deal with politics. And they say that we are going to present each mayoral candidate with 3 demands. Did you read it? And what are those 3 demands, they said? We want now to have a terminal market, a cooperative market that belongs to us as Koreans, so that they can control both the what? Wholesale and what? Retail end of the deal. We're not going to even buy from the whites out there in the Bronx Terminal Market. That's what we want. And we're going to vote for mayors, and we're going to fund their campaign based on whether they can meet this demand. The second demand, we want these mayors to keep out these big vendors like Pathmark and the others because they compete against our small businesses. And therefore, we want the zoning laws maintained so that they will not be admitted, so that they can compete against us. This is what people do. They gain power and they use power, you understand? And they gain the important base first, you see? Then their third demand was what? We want the mayor to crack down on what? Vendors. And to sweep the vendors off of the sidewalks. Okay? And you're beginning to see the effects of it. In fact, within about 13 days after they made this demand, Dinkins expanded the vendor squad, bringing in new vans and new personnel and so forth, and stated very clearly that it's not such a great problem to remove the vendors because they have no political constituency. So what are we saying? What are we saying here? So now we got the right to vote, and our vendors are being swept off the street. We got the right to vote, and we are hungry and homeless in the street. We got the right to vote, and now we are jobless and underemployed and unemployed. We got the right to vote, and we're sitting in schools with asbestos and lead and poor teaching facilities. So now you got the abstract rights and the civil rights. But in what way has it really given you a right to be a real human being in America? Cruz summarized this in his critique of this assimilationist leadership. No one knows better than the political ruling class that the political, economic, and cultural policies that monitor the internal affairs of American society are not inspired by moral considerations, but are based on the imperatives of power, especially economic power. The conceptual linking of integration with civil rights effectively obscures that by eliminating discrimination in public accommodations, in voting rights and employment opportunities, neither ethnicity nor cultural diversity is therefore divested of any social meaning or function. The cultural pluralism remains operative. What is he saying here? He's saying that, okay, getting voting rights, getting rid of discrimination in public and private places does not remove people's sense of ethnic identity. In other words, they can still vote, or you can gain the vote, but they will still identify themselves what? Ethnically. They will still act what? Ethnically. There was somebody that tried to tell us that once we got the vote and once we integrated schools and so forth, that these people would lose their ethnic sense. But he's telling you that is not true. As a consequence of civil rights legislation, the dominant culture is still left free to thwart or otherwise limit the social range of integration of the minority group. But on the other hand, the elimination of legally enforced exclusion by reasons of race or ethnicity does in fact enhance the minority group's freedom and flexibility to develop the internal resources of its own political, economic, and cultural plurality. But what is the key is this. The Civil Rights Acts of 1964-65 outlawed the use of race as a basis for making decisions affecting individuals, not groups. It was an ill-conceived conclusion on the part of the civil rights leaders to expect that desegregation in the private and public sectors of an institutionalized economy would transform American society into a nation of desegregated hearts and minds. Let me put it this way. There are a lot of us who like to talk about this individualism. You know, people do what they want individually, and we are talking about individual freedom. And I ask you this question. If you believe so much in individuals and that individuals are so different and that individuals have different tastes and that individuals then will do their things in different ways, why is it that 180 million white individuals don't do business with you? Why is it that 8 million, 7 million Asian individuals free to act on their own individual impulses don't do business with you? You would think if they were so individually different, if they had such individually different tastes, they would interact with you and there would be true integration. But somehow these individuals seem to think pretty much alike when it comes to us as people. Every other group of individual peoples somehow seem to think alike in dealing with black folk. So it says then, you can have individual freedoms, but you can still act like an ethnic group and still use your ethnic identity as a basis for power. And therefore, gaining abstract individual rights in no way means that other people will not continue to act as groups and to use their group as a means of dominating other groups and moving other groups forward. But we forgot that lesson. And so now, as a result of the assimilationist leadership, we find ourselves with all of these abstract rights, and yet it is ashes in our mouths. And we have some other group here called neoconservatives, which I cannot discuss tonight. It really doesn't deserve the term leadership group at all, but it's getting great exposure because it is in line with the crypto-racist white conservatives. They are funded by the white conservatives. They are funded by the white foundations. We discuss in Blueprint for Black Power the power of foundations and of think tanks. You see, we have a dim view as black people of intellectuals. And I must tell you, nothing is more practical than an intellectual theory, ladies and gentlemen. Concepts are the most concrete means of power that you can find. Right. And somehow somebody has convinced us that thinking conceptually is a non-African mode of thought. Somebody comes telling us that we are a non-linear people, that we are spiritual and intuitive, and that thinking logically and thinking analytically and thinking conceptually is somehow the property of white folk. God gave you two sides to your doggone brain. And one brain in one side is for intuition, one side is for holistic thinking, one side is for spiritual thinking. Yes, but you got another side. That's that left side that is the side of logic, that is the side that uses symbols, that is the side that uses analysis. God gave you two sides. He gave you a logical side and an intuitive side. Don't let any joker tell you that your only role is to be intuitive and to be people who can only estimate and approximate. How can you look at the great pyramids of Egypt and the great mathematics and then turn around and say that you are only a spiritual and intuitive people? You've got to be crazy. Let me tell you, and this is one of the problems I want to talk about when I talk about nationalists. Be careful that in your effort to separate yourself from white folk, you don't wrap white stereotypes in kente cloth. Okay? And this is happening to a lot of us. The same stereotypes that these people have laid on us, that we can't think straight, we can't think logically, we are emotionally oriented, we are overrun by spiritualism and spiritism, that we like to guess, that we don't know the real and true answer. This is the same game that whites been laying on us. Then we get some guys who want to come in and says, this is naturally African, and now we feel all right about it. Get out of here. We got some people telling us, you know, that we are an oral people, and we are an oral people. But They want to make us think that oral communications is the only means by which we as African people should communicate with one another. You got to be out of your mind in a day and age of electronic communications and computers and so forth to lean on an antiquated methods of oral presentation. It is no way I can deliver here in this oral presentation the kind of information that can be delivered in a book. And therefore, you must become a book-reading people. You must become a people who can analyze words. You must become a people with a vast vocabulary. You must become a people who can process the highest words and the most difficult words rapidly, because these are the people who are opposing you and who intend to bring your life to an end. Be careful. Let me tell you quickly what these institutions will do for you. You think they're just collections of intellectuals thinking, right? Forget it. Let's look at what the Ford Foundation did here when they decided to transform the nature of social science and the way social science research was done. And they decided they would recreate the whole nature of scientific research, social science research in the universities. They created what they call a foreign area fellowship program. And they financed it. They granted over $23 million to researchers. You see, the elite doesn't play around. When they want to change the nature of things, they fund those things. They build institutions and think tanks and the whole bit. And we lay all of this out in Blueprint for Black Power. That's why you got to have think tanks. That's why you got to have a whole set of institutions. You see, that's why your goal must be, as our goal is in the African world, info systems, to write all of the books that are being read in the Black Studies programs. That's what you got to do. As this next generation of black students move through the universities, there's got to be your nationalistic books and your nationalistic perspectives and your African-centered perspectives that they study from. They must crowd out any other point of view in the university. It must be African-centered professors educated in African-centered institutions that sit as the chairpersons of the departments. That's why I tell people I'm not writing for the current generation, I'm writing for the next one. So when those students move through the Black Studies programs and the other studies programs, and they read Black on Black Violence, Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children, the Falsification of African Consciousness, Understanding Black Adolescent Male Power, Violence, Blueprint for Black Power, Educating Black Children for the 21st Century, they will have a conceptual orientation toward the world such that they will now move in the interest of African people and not against that interest. But if you're not publishing, if you're not putting the textbooks out, if you're not educating the professors, if you're not putting your people in the departments, if you're not making your teachers, if you're not placing them in the schools, then you cannot transform the opinions and orientations of your upcoming generations. And a people who have real power do these things, ladies and gentlemen. You must understand that. Now, these people decided then, now let's look at the statistics as a result of their funding this Foreign Area Fellowship Program. Statistics will demonstrate just how successful this program has been in strengthening American higher education. Strengthening. Of the 984 former fellows, you know, they call them fellows, you know, after you in postgraduate training, or you're a fellow at the Brookings Institute, or you're a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, you know, something like that. You sit there and you do research and you do postdoctoral work. And we talk about how this is done, how ultimately let me show you how these people end up. Okay? So they graduated 984. 550 hold faculty positions in 181 colleges and universities in 38 states. This is how you do it. Some 29 universities employed 5 or more fellows. 10 universities have employed 10 or more. In addition to academic and teaching careers, 82 former fellows are now in government service. You put your people in policy positions. 38 are now in philanthropic or nonprofit organizations, so they can tell the NAACP and the black conservatives what to do. 45 are in business or professions. Many former fellows have added to our knowledge of the non-Western world through the publications of the results of research. African-centered education is much larger than the teaching of African history and culture. Much larger. You must have a world knowledge and a knowledge of the world. You must have European experts as a part of your African-centered institutions. You must get to know intimately the cultures of other people and know their psychologies. You must get to know the real history of the world, for history is the best psychology text of all because it demonstrates the nature of human behavior, not the psychology books. Must understand that. I had one young man who's so happy he's at NYU. He said, oh, I'm learning so much, and I'm so happy. I'm in this class in economics. You know, I said, well, now, why are you in that class? And they're doing all these circles and curves and, you know, cost and all these kind of figures, which Negroes think are magic signs for making money. You see, so they think if they learn all this voodoo, that they're going to come out and be like the white folk. But remind that professor that the American economy is not ultimately based on the management skills of American management. It's not based on the organization of American corporations. What ultimately is it based on? Upon the murdering of Indians and the stealing of their lands. So that the economic course essentially is a course in how the booty is going to be divided among American people.
That's right.
When you look at the real world, you note that people establish themselves economically first by taking over economic resources and viable resources. That's it. You study your own history. How did the Empire of Mali come into being? How did Ghana come into being? How did Songhai come into being? Struggles over what? Gold and salt, and who won, and over trade routes and other things. And people went to war and took those things from one and another. And those who gained control over them then built empires and nations and so forth as a basis of that. Not just studying economics 101 and business administration. But you got to learn real history. You got to learn a history that goes beyond just the celebration of African heroes and the celebration of African culture. You got to learn how it's really done in the world. So these people now, many former fellows have added to our knowledge of the non-Western world through the publications of the results of research. Altogether, they have published some 373 books, over 3,000 articles and short monographs. Moreover, they have edited or contributed to another 516 volumes. This is how you change minds. What is going on with Henry Louis Gates? What is going on with Cornel West? Who says that black leaders, serious black leaders, must be race transcending? You know, How the hell are you going to be a serious black leader and be race transcending? You know, but that's the dilemma of the assimilationists. They want race and not race at the same time. They want to organize black people based on blackness so that they can get rid of blackness. They want to use your black interests, your black feelings, and your black identity to advance their program so they can tell you later that blackness does not matter, that color has nothing to do with it. We are better off when we don't even refer to ourselves as black.